Hi, and welcome back to Grow Live 2021, day 2. What a fun-packed day it has been so far, and now we're working towards our session with David Heffernan. So, Dead Man Walking, he's been to over 3,000 funerals. I'm not quite sure how he's found the time. He's seen thousands of grieving family members and spoken with them and helped them. He was homeless at 16. He's had death threats and armed robberies, and do you know what? That's not even scratching the surface and the beginning of David Heffernan's experiences. So rather than listen to me go on about it, let's bring him up on here and allow him to introduce himself and tell you a bit about his story. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Off you. Yeah, good. So thank you, first of all, for allowing me to speak at Grow Live. There's been some incredible sessions already today, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow as well. So thank you. I feel privileged and honoured to actually have been asked for this. So thank you. Which leads me on to a little bit about my talk is all around, and that's around gratitude. And the attitude of gratitude is one of the things that we can do that will empower us to live the best possible life that we can possibly live. Now, you're going to hear, as Duncan's just alluded to, there's going to be some quite dark things happening, but there'll also be a lot of humour in the story as well. So I'm not going to drag you down and keep there. I'll be lifting you back up as well. And I truly believe there is always a positive and a learning curve in every experience we go through. And I will show and prove in every experience I've gone through, there is a positive, there is a learning curve, and there is a way to grow through all this. There'll be a story of resilience, a story of how active listening can change so many lives as well as your own, and also gratitude being the absolute ultimate goal that people should be living with to make their life and other people's lives better. So with no further ado, I'm going to share a video first, which is a song that resonates so much with my life and my story and what my mission is all about. So if you can just bear with us for 4 minutes, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to put this song on, and then I'm going to go straight into the talk, if that's okay with you lot. Thank you very much. So share screen, make sure I do the sound. I'm no good at technology, so I need to make sure everything. There we go. Such powerful words, and a song, as I say, resonates with me so much. Only 3 days ago, a close family friend, a friend of my wife's, hung himself. At the core of everything I do, it's all around making people and allowing people to be heard. We need to start speaking. We need to start listening, but without looking away, without being distracted by anything, we need to start actively listening. And part of my story is where it all starts, is how I learned to listen. And as a result, in the last 40 years, I have spoken with over 3,000, 4,000 people who have been suicidal and supported them, as well as people who have been grieving. And it all starts through listening. So where does it all start? I grew up in a place called Odsall, only a couple of miles away from the legend that is Brad Burton, who was born in Broughton, literally a mile and a half away from me, same age, grew up in the same sort of streets and same areas. And at 5 years old, I was very fortunate enough to be living right next to Salford Docks before it became Salford Media City, Salford Quays. And I was so blessed to remember a time where the ships were still coming in, the old dockers and the workers were still working. And as a 5-year-old, I used to run across Trafford Road that they used to call Barbary Coast, because it had people from Barbados, from Jamaica, from all over Europe coming to Salford Docks with the spices and the fruits and whatever. It was an incredible place to be part of. And I used to run across Trafford Road and I'd sit by the dock office at 5 years old, and my dad didn't even have a clue I was out of the house. And I would just sit there, and that was my first real introduction to mindfulness without even realizing that it was mindfulness. I would just sit there and I would lose myself. And I would just be in the moment. Nothing could touch me. Nothing could distract me. Nothing could get to me. I would just be there in that moment, watching and smelling everything that was around me. And it was a wonderful time. But something else happened at 5 years old. I joined a primary school, Catholic primary school called St. Joseph's, and there was a church attached to the school. And I remember pretty much after my first 2 weeks, the priest, Father Carey, walked into my class and took me by the hand, and he led me back to the church. Now, we all have heard many stories about the Catholic Church in the 80s with young boys. Unfortunately, nothing like that happened to me, but something did happen, and it was extremely significant to how I lived my life from that point on. I was told at 5 years old that I was going to be an altar boy. Now, I wasn't asked, I was told, because I was quite good at reading at an early age. They said I could read some of the sermon, and so I therefore was going to be an altar boy and serve on the altar. But that very next day, I served my very first funeral. And I remember it to this day. I remember it vividly. I remember the coffin was so higher than me. It was on a steel table, steel legs. And there was over 100, 120 people all grieving and crying in front of me. And I looked like the Milky Bar Kid. I had black National Health glasses on, I had beautiful blonde hair, and I looked the spitting image of the Milky Bar Kid. And I didn't have a clue what was going on. And it was quite terrifying. I remember the emotions coming up now, just thinking back to that moment. And Ofsted and social services would be involved now, but it was normal back in the day to do that sort of thing. And so I got through that funeral, but every single day, pretty much, I served a funeral. The first hour and a half of my school day would be going across to the church and serving funerals. And between the age of 5 and 8, I'd served approximately about 400 funerals. So I became so used to death and grief at such an early age. Again, not normal, but that was my world. And so I embraced it. 8 years old, something crazy happened. Adults would sit next to me and they would just pour their heart out. Now, 8 years old, I couldn't offer advice, but what I could do was listen. And for the next 8 years, adults would sit next to me and they would pour their heart out. But I remember at 8 years old, just seeing the pain etched on their faces when they was talking and saying the words, "I wish." All I could hear in those conversations was, "I wish I," or "I wish they." And this genuinely terrified me. I didn't know what regret was, but I knew it was toxic. I knew that this caused so much pain for these people that the deceased had left behind. And so I remember going to the priest at 8 years old and I'd asked the question, how do I live a life of no regret? Now, I got a 10-year-old and he wouldn't ask this sort of question. He's more interested in V-Bucks for the Xbox account. But because this was my world, it was a question that I felt comfortable asking for the priest. And rather than slapping me and saying, "Go away," he actually sat me down and said, "Dave, in order to live a life of no regret, you need to make peace with your decisions, both good and bad, immediately." And I remember walking out of that church at 8 years old, back to my house, and I must have looked an absolute psychopath because I was shaking my head and I was shaking my fists. And all the way home, I just kept on saying, "No regret, no regret, no regret." And I sit here now and you'll hear some of my story and you'll hear stuff that could have broken a person, a human being and a person's soul. But I sit here now with absolutely not one single regret. In fact, my 10-year-old who I've just been talking about there, when he was 8 years old, 2 years ago, he turned around to me and said, "Dad, if you died today, I wouldn't be bothered." So I did say to him, I said, I have got contacts with social services. We do need to flesh this out because that doesn't sound very nice, does it? And he said, "No," he said, "if you die today, Dad, you've done enough." 8 years old as a child for me, 8 years old as a child for my son. Children do what we do, not what we say. And he has seen and heard me on the phone to people who have been suicidal. He's seen me speaking with homeless people. He's seen me speaking to people who have been at their lowest ebb. And he's getting an empathy matched by a few now because he's following my lead. He's doing what I'm doing, not just what I'm saying. So moving forward, I lived in a very rough council estate called Odsall. And it was actually labelled on a Channel 4 documentary as being the roughest council estate in the whole of Europe. In the early 90s, when we had the riots, there was a Channel 4 documentary and it actually labelled Odsall as being one of the roughest council estates in Europe, which is not a label you want to be proud of. Now, this gets me on to one of my first lessons that I like to talk about. And when you consider things that are happening at the moment with Brexit and, with everything that's going on negative in the world with the COVID and pandemic and vaccinations and all that sort of stuff, We've become a society that we just only want to read the headline and not understand the story. And the one thing that I do and have done for many, many years is try to understand the story and not look at the headline and make a judgment. Because what's happening now is when people think of Salford, when people think of Odsal, they think of the crime, they think of the poverty, they think of deprivation, they think of the chaos. But what they don't want to hear is an industry like the docks, where we have tens of thousands of workers overnight, all unskilled workers overnight lose a job with no support or help from government or local government whatsoever. There was always going to be chaos. There was always going to be crime and poverty and deprivation. But people don't want to know that. People just want to judge. And when they hear you from Salford, all of a sudden people start judging, thinking, oh, you must be a wrong one. Take a look at the Lowry Hotel, a 5-star hotel, which is in Salford. It actually labels itself as Manchester. BBC, ITV say that they're in Media City, Manchester, not Salford. They've already made judgments about the people of Salford and about Salford as a whole. And so I could encourage you just to look at the story, because everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a story. The people that are being awful to you, they've got a story. So rather than go for the attack and judge them, just step back and say, what is your story? You've got a story. Would you like to share it? And if they don't want to share it, that's fine. At least you've not added fuel to the fire and you've caused more chaos and more hurt. But if they do want to share it, you're potentially saving somebody's life. So moving forward, at the age of 9, my mum and dad split up, and I love my mum to bits. I felt I could manipulate her in any way, shape or form. She'd just do anything for me. And this one particular day, when my neighbours knew that my mum and dad were splitting up, they took me to the woods because they didn't want me there when this happened. But unfortunately, I fell ill and they took me back to the house. And when I opened the back door, I saw a scene that wouldn't be out of place in Saw. There was blood everywhere. My dad was so much anger on his face, and my mum was on the floor cowering. And when I opened the door, my mum ran out. I ran after her all the way to Regent Road, where a place I shouldn't be at 9 years old. And she didn't say a single word to me until she got on the bus, turned around and said goodbye. Now I turned back, and on the left, there was some masonettes called Paddock Field, and these would have a significance in my life going forward. But I remember running across to the masonettes and crossing over the security fence and sitting in the bin chute area and just crying for 2 hours. My dad didn't know where I was. Did my dad care? We don't know. But I stayed there for 2 hours. So between the age of 9 and 14, I became a bit of a punch bag. I became a bit of an inconvenience. I was the youngest of 3 people. So I had my brother, who was 2 years older, who I always believed was my dad's son, and my sister, who was 1 year older than me, who I believe was my mother's. And I was just that inconvenience at the end, just the independent one. And that's why I would do everything on my own. And at 14, I started getting a bit of a moral compass. I started looking around the estate that I was growing up in, and it was in the form of regeneration. So there was houses knocked down, and it was just a horrible estate to live in. And it got me thinking about all the young kids who had real negative role models. And so I said to my dad that I would love to develop a childcare club. And my dad dismissed it immediately, said, you need to be an accountant or something. You need to get out of Salford. You need to make better your life. And he genuinely thought making better your life was actually wearing a suit and going out into London or somewhere not Salford. And so for 2 years, we used to argue like cat and dog. And he would get physical. He would beat me. And it wasn't a very pleasant time. But in the back of my mind is I was going to get this childcare club. And so as soon as I left school in November the 11th, my dad actually got me an internship in Lincoln Inns Field in London for an accountancy firm, which was huge because he was unemployed for 6 years. He used to go out of the house at 6:30 in the morning and come back at 7 o'clock at night and still not be able to find work. So for him to put all the legwork to find this unbelievable opportunity for me to really make better my life, in his words, I turned around to him and said, have you not listened to a word I've said for the last 2 years? I want to develop a childcare club. I want to get this up and running. I've got no other intention of doing anything else until that is done. And so he did what he thought was best for me, and he threw me out that night. And it was pissing down with rain. I remember walking down the path, turning around, and he shut the door, turned the lights off and went to bed. And it was 11 o'clock at night. And my first night was spent in a brick bin shed with cobwebs. It smelled of urine and it was disgusting. But when I woke up that next morning, I woke up with a resolve. A resolve had built up inside of me. I could have quite easily gone to my dad's and said, look, I'm sorry, I'll do what you want me to do. But I thought, what was the point of the last 2 years? What has it taught me, if not to actually go for what I want and actually live the life on my terms? And so I set about knocking on office doors on Salford Quays. As Salford Quays was being built, I started knocking on office doors, asking for money. And for 3 months, I got not one single yes. I was still walking around in the same clothes that I had on when I walked out of my dad's house. There was no mobiles, no internet, no signal into charities, housing charities or anything like that. I just was living at that time in a cemetery in Weast. For 3 months, I would just take a gravestone and I would look at who had died and what year, and what would be for several hours, I would just sit back and I would go back in time and actually recreate their story and keep their legacy alive. And every single day for 3 months, I would take a new gravestone and I would do exactly the same. And that would give me the mental strength to go out and try and get the money for this childcare centre. After about 7 months, I still wasn't getting anywhere and I was seriously underweight. I was in a bad position. And I went to the council for the 4th time asking for money. And there was a gentleman there who was trying to get people onto the old YTS schemes, which is a bit like apprenticeships now. But it was slave labour back in the day. I think it was £30 every fortnight they paid you. And I told him, I'm not interested. I want to get this childcare club up and running. And again, just like the priest before me, he sat me down and said, have you got a business plan? I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. He said, what about marketing strategy? Again, no idea. And he took me to Salford Prison that day and he bought me 2 suits and he got my hair cut and he gave me a little bit of money. And for a month, he taught me a little bit about business and what to say and how to present myself to the companies asking for money. And within the space of 30 knocks on doors, I got 25 yeses and enough money to set it up. It was an incredible moment in my time, in my life. And my role was to get that childcare club up and running. It wasn't to run it. It wasn't to manage it. It wasn't to move it forward. It was just to get it up and running because I felt there was other people like the council who could do a better job than me. And in truth be known, my mental state and my physical state weren't the greatest. As I say, I was seriously underweight. I was vomiting every day. I wasn't in a good place. And so I handed the keys over to the council. And soon after that, I got rushed in, under blue lights to the hospital. I swallowed my tongue and I was seriously malnourished. I think I was something like 6.5 stone at the age of 17. And I spent a couple of weeks in hospital having fluids and getting myself back up to the right mental state and the right physical state. But soon after I came out of hospital, the council had closed the childcare club. It wasn't their passion. It wasn't their reason for being at the time. They was more interested in getting money from Salford Quays and new housing. They didn't really care much about the kids of Salford. Now, I could have been quite bitter and twisted at that point because I nearly killed myself getting this childcare centre up and running. But I also recognised, judging from what the priest had said to me 9 years earlier, he said, make peace with your decisions, good and bad. And that is such powerful advice because we keep hold of stuff that doesn't serve us. We keep hold of stuff that we cannot change. And by keeping hold of this stuff, anxiety and stress live where resistance is to what is. And I accepted this is what is. I took it as far as I could. I had my goal and I achieved my goal. How many of us keep on and keep on and keep on after we've achieved that goal? Brad Burton talks about this brilliantly. Find your sweet spot and just relax and carry on. And that is perfect advice. How many of us want more and more and more and more and forget the reasons why we're doing things? It is so important to actually just grab hold of those goals, achieve them, and then just live off the spoils of those and relax and just enjoy life and make peace with any decisions, because I guarantee any experience that we go through, we've got a positive and a learning curve, but we focus too much on the negative, which drags us down into a place we don't want to be. So fortunately, I got myself a job in a nursing home, and my role, because I knew I was still homeless, my role was to clean the dead bodies from when they passed away, ready to the undertaker take them away. And they used to let me sleep at night because they knew that I wasn't getting much sleep in the bin chute area or the drug dealer squat that I was living in. And so there was one particular lady I always like to talk about, because I like to keep her legacy alive, even though it's not the most amazing of stories. She looked like Rose from Titanic, beautiful white hair, frail, about 97 years old. And she unfortunately passed away. And so I was called in to just be with her and give her a bit of dignity whilst the undertaker came in to take her away. And so I was stood there, she was lay across like that, and I was stood there. And all of a sudden, she just started sitting up like this. And it's amazing how people don't tend to pass away in a nursing home in the middle of the afternoon. It's always 2, 3 o'clock in the morning when it's spooky hour. And this lady just sat up like this. And I'm not ashamed to say it, I grabbed her by the face and I threw her down and I ran out of that room because I was absolutely panicking. And the matron pissed herself laughing and say, oh, it's just a release of gas. Some people fart, some people do a little bit of a sit-up. It's just a release of all that gas, exit gas. I didn't last in that job much longer after that. And so I managed to find myself a homeless hostel in Walter Green Court, Salford Precinct. And my flatmates turned out to be an ex-thief, drug dealer, an armed robber, and me. Talking about judging earlier, you know, I could have quite easily just sat in my room and hid myself away because these weren't my people. I was a good person. Yet I found myself in a situation where I'm sat now and living with an armed robber, a thief, and a low-level drug dealer. But rather than shut myself away, I actually got to know them. I actually understood that they had a story, and I wanted to know what their story was. And because I'd shown the respect, I heard stories of abuse, stories of pain and anguish that most people would never go through in life. And they wasn't as fortunate enough as me to have people in their life where I recognized this was a sliding doors moment where it was a positive. And so they ended up in that situation where they found themselves doing armed robbery, doing drugs or whatever it may be. And they used to call me straighthead. I'd never take drugs, I'd never drink excessively, I'd never go out at night with them because it was quite clear what I was planning to do. And so one morning I managed to get myself a job, and it was telemarketing. Has anybody ever done telemarketing? Where you just ring up random people. We know what it's like when we get random calls, and it tends to be from Mumbai or Egypt or whatever. So I had one the other day actually from the CAB offering me Sky. You know, I mean, the CAB don't offer Sky, but hey ho, you know, it was a random call scam. And I hated it with a passion. It was before the auto dial-up days. So I just used to press any number and pretend to speak. And that in itself is a skill. When you've got 20, 30 people around you and you're pretending to sell something that you're not even speaking to anybody about, that's a skill in itself. But unfortunately, I lasted 2 days and I got sacked, which wasn't really hard because I didn't sell anything, because I didn't actually speak to anybody apart from my brother, and I phoned for a pizza on the way home. And about a week later, I went in to get my wages because at this point, I was 18 years old and I needed money. And they just laughed at me. They just laughed at me and said, you're not getting paid. You've done no work. Get out of the building. And I remember it now. I can go back to that moment immediately. I remember sitting down and cross-legged like Buddha, and I refused to leave. And it was so cringeful and so embarrassing. The security guards came and lifted me up by my elbows when still my legs were crossed, and they just carried me out of the building and put me in the lift and pressed the lift. But whilst I was going towards the lift, I started screaming abuse at them. And I screamed that I'm going to see this place go up in smoke, meaning I'm going to take you to court for money, which is laughable now. Unfortunately, a couple of weeks later, I get a knock on the door and it was Salford CID. And the words came out, are you David Heffernan? So I said, yes. I said, you're being charged with arson. You don't have to say anything unless you wish to do so. But anything you do say, make you saving evidence. And they put me in handcuffs and took me away. Unfortunately, the place had gone up in smoke. And I didn't have a clue how on earth this happened. I just knew it wasn't me. How many of us live with these imaginary bars in front of our face, not achieving what we want to achieve, not doing what we want to do, what we know is our life's purpose, but something is holding us back? And we feel like we're in this prison cell and we cannot get out of it. Every single one of you have got the golden key that can open that cell door and walk. It's just a matter of choice and a matter of commitment and consistency. Yeah, I was facing, as an 18 years old man, 7.5 years in real prison. And I'm not ashamed to say that suicide, that was my first thought of suicide, because I genuinely could not accept or anticipate how I would cope in prison. I was still convinced myself I was a good lad. I was a good man trying to do good in the world. How the hell is this happening to me? And I genuinely thought I would be better off out of here, but I never acted on this. But I understood what fear and anxiety was, because I really went in myself for 3 months whilst I was answering bail, ready for the court date. And when I answered bail for the 4th time, the police officer said, "You can go, you're cleared." And I said, "I need a bit more than that, because you just ruined my life. My mental state is not very good." And he says, "Somebody's accepted they've done it. Somebody's owned up to it. You can go. That's all you knowing." And I went to the court date. I found out when the court date was, and it turned out to be the drug dealer who lived in my flat. And apparently, when I went back home, I was in an absolute rage, and I was telling them exactly what I'd said. And he took it literally. And out of a sense of loyalty to me, he went to that office, stole a few computers, and set it alight. Now, here's the thing. We go back to Salford Council, who were there to safeguard the children's futures. And when I gave them the key to that childcare club, they ran it into the ground. They didn't care. These are people who we're supposed to look up to, who we're supposed to really respect. Yet the scum of the earth, the ones that we look down upon as being the wrong uns, because I did not judge them, because I treated them as human beings, because I was genuinely interested in them, when the shit hit the fan and he realized that I was being charged for something I didn't do, he went to the police station, and his words were, and I quote, "I cannot accept somebody so straight going down for something he didn't do. I confess." And I was there for the sentencing, and he got 7 years in prison. He gave up his life for me. Yet these are people that we're supposed to look down upon, that society looks down upon. Every single person has got a story. How many times, I was talking about my wife's friend who unfortunately ended his life through suicide last week. How many times do we see on social media people having a rant or saying that they're depressed or feeling low, and we get reams of inbox me on, "I'm there for you, don't worry about it, anytime." I have spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of people over the years, especially when social media has been prominent, where if I had not been tagged, or if I had not seen this post and actually picked up the phone to them, they would not be here now. Because unfortunately what happens is it could be 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. These people are not thinking logically. These people are thinking, nobody cares, I'm better off out of here. So when they pick up the phone at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, when they're needing that desperate plea to be heard, and that person, that friend, is asleep, as we would be at 3 o'clock in the morning, all they're thinking of, he said that he was going to be there. Sorry, my son's friends just knocked on. So that is the pivotal moment where he says, "I've just had it confirmed that nobody cares." We need to start looking at what we say on social media. Just like what I said with the drug dealer and the armed robber, "I'm going to see his place, call me smoke," and shared my story. He took that literally, and he did that on my behalf. Yet so many people just say these words, "I'm there for you anytime," with no caveat, with no explanation that, you know what, I've got a life as well. I'm going to be sleeping, I'm going to be working. And whenever I see a post like this, I always put in the papyrus number or Samaritan's number just in case, because I don't want people getting a missed call at 3 o'clock in the morning from somebody saying, "Well, you was going to be there." And we hear that they've passed away. Okay, so please, if you take anything from this, just think about what you're saying to people who are showing signs of pain or anguish on social media. Another thing that is important as well, that really upsets me, is so many family members and friends says, but they've been fine for the last couple of days. They've been fine for the last week. This is the moment we need to be totally aware of. Because if somebody's gone from positive, happy, to feeling really depressed and really low and not showing an interest in the world, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, they start being content and happy and saying, I love you, and going up to family members, that is the pivotal moment that we really need to be on it. And we cannot force somebody into suicide by asking them the question, are you suicidal? And I've had to ask that question at least 4 times in the last 2 weeks. And I can assure you 100%, we cannot force anybody to take their own life by asking that question. It shows that you care. But please understand that once they open up, we need to actively listen and give them a space where they're not being judged and they can be heard. And that will save more lives than we can ever imagine. Moving forward, it was Jerry, I've got a cat now. Moving forward, at 19 years old, I managed to get myself a job, managed to get myself a house. Seriously, Jerry. And managed to get myself a job, managed to get myself a house. And I then got a knock on the door again. It was Salford Police. And I thought, what on earth have I done now? And it was a different world back then. No DBS checks, no nothing. But he turns around to me and says, we've been speaking with social services and the council, and we've got a new project. And it's basically, we're going to be working in the red light districts in Manchester. And your name, Jerry, your name came up in conversation several times. Go for it. And we thought we'd have a chat to see if you'd be interested in doing some outreach work in the red light districts in Manchester. Now, this was the early 90s. This was 92, 93. And back in the 80s, in the red light districts, it used to be the boyfriends pimping out the girlfriends. But in the early 90s, it started getting into territory war. So we had the Chinese triads and we had the Jamaican yardies and everybody in between fighting for territory within Manchester. And then you had the milk bar kid in the middle trying to work with young girls, trying to get them back out of prostitution, back into education, childcare, etc., etc. And there was one young girl, Keely, who I will always talk about with every talk that I do, because we become desensitized in life. And we watch all these programs and films and TV, and we start not understanding that there's a real world out there that's happening, a real painful world for people. And we make jokes and we don't think we're hurting people, but I've been in the middle of this and I've seen the pain that this causes. And so there's one young girl who was 14 and she was riddled with drugs. She was in a bad way. And she came up to me one night and said, Dave, I need to die. Now, as I've said, I've spoken with hundreds, thousands of people who've been suicidal, and not one single person has said, I need to die. Every single person said, I want to die. She is the only person all that time that I said, I need. And so we worked with her for about 3 months to get that glint back in the eye. And she came back and said, Dave, I want to make good my life. I want to go back into education and childcare. Now, it was childcare that unfortunately got her life on the street because of the abuse she'd received in childcare. So that was a huge, huge decision for her. But because we didn't have internet and mobile phones or anything like that back in the day properly, I had to unfortunately say to her, I said, I'll come back tomorrow and we'll process you tomorrow when it's a bit early, you know, when everybody's open, all the offices are open. That night she panicked and she told the pimp what she was planning to do. And her pimp was, has anybody ever seen The Green Mile? The black guy who's walking down, 6'4", Jamaican yardie, huge head, evil, so cold. And rather than let her go, knowing that was a conveyor belt of girls coming his way, he doused her in petrol and burnt her alive and threw in a skip. And I get the call that night to go and identify this young girl's body. And I was only 19 at the time. And I had to identify this young girl's body, whose child remains I couldn't identify. The only way I could identify was from the gold jewelry she had. How many of us has ever made a decision when stressed? It doesn't work out in our favor. Very rarely does it work out in our favor. Rather than let the police deal with it, I went running into the red light district and confronting this 6'4" Jamaican yard. In that time, I was about 5'6", 5'7". It was never going to work out in my favor. And unfortunately, he gave me a whack across the face and my jaw went flying. It broke in 3 different places and he started stamping on my face. That's partly why I look a little bit like Quasimodo at times, because my face I've had 3 broken jaws, 3 reconstructions, and so my face is slightly slanted. I also have Bell's palsy as well, which makes me look like a miserable git. The amount of times people say to me, we smile, and I can't, because my face is frozen. But this guy just stood on my face several times, and I ended up in hospital for several months getting my face reconstructed. Now, I hated myself. I've got a band here from the 9/11 Memorial Museum that says love is stronger than hate. Hate is one of the most toxic things that we can have in our lives. Just to hear that word hate fills me with absolute chills and dread. But I hated myself. I had so much guilt. I had so much shame. All I kept on thinking about is if I would have took that girl out that night, last night, she would have been safe. And I tried to remember what the priest said. Didn't resonate. Because how can you make peace with that decision when I just sent somebody to the death? Well, that's what I was convincing myself, that I sent somebody to their death. And it took me about 3 or 4 months of just sitting, not being able to move properly, numb with fear, numb with guilt, numb with shame, didn't have any interest in life. And it culminated in me sitting in the bath, full of water with a razor blade, and I attempted to save my life. And with hindsight, it was half-hearted. It was a cry for help. I was at such a low, I could not physically see a way out of it. But as soon as I felt the pain from that razor, something happened. And that night, I just got a little glimmer of white hope. And I started thinking back to what the priest said about making peace. And logistically, there was nothing we could have done. We had done everything that we could have possibly done at that time. And so therefore, we couldn't have changed anything. And as soon as I heard myself saying that, a little bit of glimmer of white hope came in and I grabbed hold of it. And I grabbed hold of it and I just kept on thinking about it. Just like the 8-year-old who was saying no regret, I was just constantly saying, control the controllables, control the controllables. And that's all I could say until the point of the white light getting wider and wider and wider so I could get a bit more clarity. And then it came down to forgiveness. I had to forgive myself for the hatred that I felt for people. I hated him. If I would have seen that guy, I would have quite happily killed him without thought or emotion. And so I end up writing 2 letters, one to the pimp and one to myself, forgiving both. And it took me about 3 months of reading these letters out morning, noon, and night until it felt real, until it felt like it was coming from the heart. And as soon as I could feel it from the heart and I could forgive, the weight just lifted off my shoulders and I could feel that I was free from all the darkness, from the pain and everything else. And to this day, anybody who has a forgiveness issue, I have never and will never charge anybody who needs to deal with a forgiveness issue, because I know how powerful it is to be able to forgive yourself and to forgive somebody else who has sought to do you harm physically or emotionally. And so my life started getting back, but I started craving the freedom I had on the streets. I got a job, I got a house, it was boring. I started craving freedom. So I bought myself a tent and I went to the Lake District thinking if I'm going to be homeless, I'd rather be homeless somewhere completely free where I could just walk for miles and be alone. And that first night I got friendly with a local farmer and I told him a story and he said, you can pitch a tent in the corner plot of my field. Whatever you catch is yours. Beautiful woodland around me, beautiful scenery, nightlight, no nightlight whatsoever, just beautiful stars, galaxies, whatever you want to call it, as my ceiling. And for a whole year, I pretty much lived off the land. He taught me how to catch wildlife. He taught me what berries and fruit and whatever you could be took from the trees and cooked, and which mushrooms to have and not to go all hallucinogenic and what have you. And I lived a full year, all 4 seasons, just living in this little tent. And it was amazing. But when you're looking up at that night sky with no light pollution, you realize very quickly how insignificant we are in the grand scheme of things. And I don't mean that as being worthless. What I mean is all we can impact are those around us. And we have such a value to this planet. People think big, big, big. yet it's just small actions that can create the ripple effect. And so I start off by things like, if I'm going out in my car, I'll let people out of the junction and I'll wave. Guaranteed, if you follow that person, he will let out or she will let out the next person at the junction. And before you know it, you've inspired and had a positive impact on 100, 200 people that day. And you only know about the one or two that you've seen. If I'm walking behind a lady or an old woman, I cross the road, get in front of her. That's had a positive impact. She feels safer now. Just little things like this absolutely have a huge ripple effect. And if we can all come together collectively, just doing these positive motions like this, we can have a huge effect on our immediate world and the bigger world. So I'm just conscious of the time. So the last one is going to be about my health, because I talked earlier about the attitude of gratitude and how being grateful is the key to living a life that you fully deserve and fully design, and not one that's designed for you. Several years ago, I started becoming breathless and I couldn't ride my bike downhill. That's how bad it was. And so I ended up going to the doctors and they said I had asthma. Then they said, no, not. And it went back and forth until they did a COPD test. They ruled out COPD, but also ruled out asthma. And they said, something's going on with your lungs. So they sent me to the lung consultant and he said, yeah, you've got a paralyzed diaphragm. And at the time, 42% vital lung capacity. It's now 30%. He said, we don't believe it's a standalone thing. So he sent me to the neurologist, who, long story short, diagnosed with a rare form of motor neuron disease. So in the space of being told they had asthma, I then get told they had a lung issue, a paralyzed diaphragm, 30% vital lung capacity, motor neuron disease. And more recently, I've been told that I've got severe spinal canal stenosis as well, which is a narrowing of the arteries in the spinal cord, which ultimately will make me paralyzed sooner rather than later. I went to a consultant's appointment a year and a half ago, and I said, give it me straight about surgery, because I work in mental health, I've got strategies can cope. And his words to me, and I quote, you may as well go to Dignitas if you was to go down the surgical route, because that's the only option available to yourself. You may as well go to Dignitas, because at least you'll have a nice holiday to Switzerland beforehand. So basically what he was saying is, Dave, if you go for surgery, 100% death. If you don't go for surgery, 100% paralysis in a wheelchair. My reaction to him was thank you. And I shook him by the hand and he was confused. And I said, just look at it. If you would have said a 40% or 50% chance of dying, that could have been playing on my mind. And that could have took me away from being a role model to my kids or a good husband to my wife. The fact that you took that out of my hands now, my decision, I don't need to think about it. I don't need to think about it. So therefore, why would I not be grateful? But more importantly, I can still be a fantastic father to my kids and a good role model to my kids in a wheelchair. But I can't be any kind of father or any kind of role model to my kids or my wife when I'm dead. So why on earth would I not be grateful for? And that gratitude has been ingrained in me over the last 30 years. Every experience that I've gone through, although dark, although depressing, I guarantee, as I said earlier, there is always a positive in a learning curve. And I learned from a very young age to look at the positive, to look at the learning curve, and to move and grow and live the life that I want to live. And I can honestly say I sit here with no regrets, even though I am a dead man walking. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, David. Thank you so much for sharing that honestly and openly and powerfully with us.
Thank you.
I really appreciated hearing that and enjoyed that. I'm sure everyone listening did. And I think one of the great things is that with all of those challenges, all of those low points, all of that, pretty heavy stuff that you were sharing with us the whole way through, you're sharing it designed to help us think differently and do things positively, grow and move forward and embrace something from that rather than just dwelling with those challenges. So thank you so much. Simon says, wow, the best talk I've heard in a long time. Dave, you are an amazing guy. Total respect.
Well, thank you. I didn't even know Simon was in. I've only got 3 people up on my screen.
Yeah, there's lots more people than you realize. Some of them have their videos off. Some are not here on the Zoom, but are watching on the replays and elsewhere as well. So yeah, your message will reach further than you imagine, David. And Gary says, wow, just wow, thank you so much. But unfortunately, we don't have time really to ask you any questions. If anyone's got one burning question, I can throw that at him quickly, whack it in the chat, or wave your hand at me quickly. Otherwise, I'm going to say, David, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Really was a great story. And if people want to find out more, then check out the Grow Live website. It's got all the information of the different speakers, including, I'm sure, information on where you can find David and anyone else that's spoken. So again, thank you very much.